The Airbnb listing called it a charming Victorian cottage in the heart of Millbrook Heights. The photos showed hardwood floors, antique furniture, and windows that let in golden afternoon light. What drew me in wasn't just the reasonable price, it was the description the host had written. Perfect for writers seeking inspiration. I was 3 months behind on my novel deadline, and my apartment in the city had become a prison of distractions and anxiety. This place seemed like salvation. The host, Margaret, was a woman in her 70s who greeted me at the door with warm cookies and an even warmer smile. She had silver hair pulled into a neat bun and wore a floral dress that looked like it belonged in a different era. Everything about her seemed to match the house, timeless, comfortable, safe. "You'll love it here, dear," she said, handing me the keys. The previous guest was a young man about your age. "Writer too," he said. "This place changed his life." She paused, her smile flickering for just a moment. "I do hope you'll find what you're looking for." The cottage was exactly as advertised. The living room had built-in bookshelves filled with classic literature, a fireplace with a comfortable reading chair positioned nearby, and a writing desk by the window that overlooked a garden filled with roses and lavender. My bedroom was upstairs, decorated with vintage wallpaper and furnished with pieces that looked genuinely antique rather than reproduction. I spent the first 2 days in a productive haze. Words flowed onto my laptop screen like they hadn't in months. I wrote in the morning light, took long walks through Millbrook Heights in the afternoon, and spent evenings reading by the fireplace. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again, like the writer I used to be, before self-doubt and creative block had taken over my life. It was on the 3rd night that I noticed the music box. I was coming back from a late dinner in town when I saw it sitting on the mantelpiece. It hadn't been there before, I was certain of that. I'd spent hours staring at that mantelpiece while thinking through plot problems, and it had been empty except for a small brass clock and a framed photograph of what I assumed was Margaret's family. The music box was beautiful in an old-fashioned way. It was made of dark wood, with intricate carvings of dancing figures around the sides. The top was inlaid with mother-of pearl in a pattern that seemed to shift and shimmer in the firelight. When I picked it up, it was heavier than I expected, and I could feel the mechanism inside waiting to spring to life. There was a small note tucked underneath it, written in Margaret's careful handwriting. "For my writing guest. May it inspire beautiful dreams." I smiled, touched by the gesture. Margaret had seemed like the type of person who believed in the power of small, meaningful gifts. I wound the key on the bottom and lifted the lid. The melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, something classical that I almost recognized but couldn't quite place. A tiny ballerina began to spin on a small stage inside the box, her painted face serene, her arms raised in eternal dance. I watched her turn for a few minutes, feeling oddly mesmerized by the combination of the melody and her graceful movements. That night, I had the most vivid dreams I'd experienced in years. I dreamed I was still in the cottage, but it was different, somehow larger, with rooms I hadn't seen before, filled with people from different time periods. There was a woman in a 1940s dress playing piano in a parlor I'd never entered. A man in Victorian clothing was writing frantically at a desk that wasn't the one by the window. Children in old-fashioned clothes were running through hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. But the strange thing was, in the dream, I wasn't just observing these people. I was one of them. I moved through their time periods like I belonged there, like I had always been there. The woman at the piano smiled at me like she knew me. The Victorian man looked up from his writing and nodded as if I were a fellow scholar. The children included me in their games without question. When I woke up, I felt more rested than I had in months. The dream lingered in my mind with unusual clarity, and I found myself eager to start writing. The words came even easier than they had before, but there was something different about them. They felt older somehow, more sophisticated. I was writing about things I'd never experienced, using turns of phrase that didn't sound like my usual voice. By lunch, I'd written more pages than I typically managed in a week. But when I read back over what I'd written, I got a strange feeling in my stomach. It was good, better than anything I'd written in years, but it didn't feel entirely like my work. The style was more elegant, more classical. The dialogue had a formality that I'd never used before. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe the cottage really was inspiring me. Maybe being surrounded by antique furniture and classic literature was influencing my writing style in a positive way. That evening, I wound the music box again. The second night's dreams were even more vivid. This time, I spent what felt like hours in a library that existed somewhere in the cottage, though I'd never seen it in waking life. The shelves stretched impossibly high, filled with books that seemed to glow with their own light. I was reading from a leather-bound journal, transcribing passages into my own notebook. The words felt important, urgent, like secrets that needed to be preserved. A woman sat across from me, the same woman from the piano dream, but now I could see her more clearly. She had dark hair pinned back in victory rolls and wore a deep blue dress. She was also writing, her fountain pen moving across the page with swift, confident strokes. "You understand now," she said without looking up from her work. "You can feel it, can't you? The connection." In the dream, I knew exactly what she meant. I could feel the presence of every writer who had ever sat in this cottage. Every person who had ever poured their soul onto paper within these walls. They were all still here, somehow, their thoughts and dreams and desperate creativity lingering in the very air. "We leave pieces of ourselves behind," she continued, "in our words, in our stories. And sometimes, if the place is right, if the circumstances align, those pieces can find new vessels." I woke up with her words echoing in my mind and a strange taste in my mouth. Ink and old paper and something metallic I couldn't identify. This time, when I sat down to write, the change was undeniable. The words flowing onto the screen weren't just influenced by other writers, they were other writers. I could feel them guiding my fingers, whispering suggestions, showing me images and scenes that had never been in my original outline. My novel was transforming into something entirely different, something far more complex and beautiful than I had ever imagined I could create. But it wasn't mine anymore. I tried to stop, tried to go back to my original story, but every time I deleted the new passages, they reappeared. Not immediately. I would save the document, close my laptop, go for a walk, but when I returned, the words would be there again, exactly as I had written them under the influence of whatever was happening to me. By the fifth day, I was afraid to sleep. The dreams had become more intense, more consuming. I was spending entire nights in conversations with writers from different eras, learning techniques and stories and secrets that no living person should know. They were teaching me, guiding me, but they were also taking something from me. Each morning, I woke up feeling a little less like myself, and a little more like an echo of someone else. I decided to confront Margaret. I found her in her garden, tending to the roses with the same gentle care she had shown me when I arrived. She looked up when she heard my footsteps on the gravel path, and her smile was as warm as ever. But there was something in her eyes, now a knowing sadness that hadn't been there before. "You want to ask me about the music box?" she said before I could speak. I nodded, suddenly feeling foolish. What was I going to say? That I thought her gift was somehow channeling the spirits of dead writers, that I was losing my own identity to their collective influence. "How many?" I asked instead. "How many what, dear? How many writers have stayed here? How many have found that music box?" Margaret set down her gardening shears and looked at me, with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to have this conversation. 17, she said quietly. "Over the past 20 years, all struggling with their work, all desperate for inspiration, all willing to accept help from any source, no matter how unusual. What happens to them? What's happening to you, I imagine? They find their voice, or rather, they find voices. The cottage remembers everyone who has poured their heart out within its walls. Writers are particularly potent. Their emotional investment leaves deep impressions. The music box is some kind of conduit. The music box is just a focus. The real power is in the cottage itself, in the accumulated creative energy of decades of desperate, brilliant people. But most guests need something tangible to open themselves up to the experience. The music box has served that purpose beautifully. I stared at her, trying to process what she was telling me. You're saying that every writer who has stayed here is somehow, still here? Not their ghosts? If that's what you're thinking, their creativity, their techniques, their knowledge, their passionate commitment to the craft, it builds up, layer by layer, until it becomes something that can interact with new arrivals. Why? The question came out more desperate than I intended. Why would you do this to people? Margaret's expression grew sad. Because they ask for it, dear. Every single one of them arrives here, broken, blocked, convinced they'll never write anything worthwhile again. They're so hungry for inspiration that they'll take it from any source. The cottage simply provides. But at what cost? That depends on the person. Some embrace the experience completely. They become conduits for all the writers who came before, and their work becomes extraordinary. Others fight it, try to maintain their individual voice, and they struggle. What happened to the writer who was here before me? The one you mentioned, when I arrived? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently stroking a rose petal. Thomas was a lovely young man, very talented, but terribly insecure about his abilities. He welcomed the voices, learned from them, allowed them to guide his work. His novel was published 6 months after he left here. It won several awards. That sounds like a success story. In some ways, it was. But Thomas isn't really Thomas anymore. The voices became so strong, so integrated into his identity, that his original personality was absorbed. He still writes, still publishes, but if you met him, you'd be meeting an amalgamation of 17 different writers, not the young man who arrived here a year ago. My blood felt like ice water in my veins, and if I keep using the music box, that's up to you, dear. You can choose to embrace what's happening, let the voices guide you to create something magnificent, or you can pack up and leave right now. Try to return to your blocked, frustrated existence, knowing that you turned away from the greatest gift any writer could receive. I looked back at the cottage, at the windows glowing warmly in the late afternoon light. I thought about the pages I'd written, the beauty and sophistication of the work, the way it felt to have access to centuries of accumulated knowledge and skill. I also thought about Thomas, about the 17 writers who had come before me, about the gradual erosion of everything that made me uniquely myself. What would you do? I asked. Margaret smiled, but it was tinged with something that might have been regret. I was a writer once too, you know, a long time ago. I was the first to discover what this cottage could offer. The implications of her words hit me like a physical blow. I looked at her more carefully, noting the way she seemed to shift slightly in the light, the way her edges seemed just a little too soft, a little too blended with her surroundings. How long ago? 1952. I was 23, writing my first novel. I found a music box in the cottage that had belonged to the previous owner. The rest, as they say, is history. You've been here for 70 years. I've been everywhere and everyone, dear. I've been every writer who ever poured their soul into this place. Margaret was just the first name, the first identity. Now I'm all of them, and they're all me. I backed away from her, my mind reeling. You're not human anymore. I'm more human than I ever was when I was limited to just one perspective, one voice, one set of experiences. I'm the collected wisdom and passion of dozens of brilliant minds. You're a ghost. I'm a library made flesh. I'm every story that was ever desperate to be told. That night, I didn't wind the music box. I sat in the living room, staring at it on the mantelpiece, weighing my options. I could pack up and leave, return to my blocked, struggling existence as a mediocre writer who might never finish his novel, or I could open that lid one more time, let the voices in completely, and become part of something larger and more magnificent than I could ever be alone. I thought about Thomas, about the awards his book had won. I thought about Margaret, about the peaceful satisfaction in her eyes when she talked about being a collection of voices rather than just one small, limited person. I thought about my own novel, sitting unfinished on my laptop, the pages I'd written, under the influence of the cottage, already the best work of my career. At midnight, I reached for the music box. As the melody filled the room and the tiny ballerina began to spin, I felt the voices calling to me, welcoming me, promising me everything I'd ever wanted as a writer. I closed my eyes and let them in completely. When I opened them again, I was no longer alone in my own mind. Thomas was there, and Margaret, and 15 others whose names I now knew as intimately as my own. Their knowledge flowed through me like water. Their techniques became my techniques. Their passion became my fuel. I finished the novel in 3 days. It was published within a year and won the same awards as Thomas's book. Critics called it a masterwork of literary fiction that seems to draw from a deep well of classical knowledge and timeless themes. If they only knew. I still live in the cottage now. Margaret and I take turns greeting new guests, though I suppose we're really the same person by this point. We're all the same person, every writer who ever discovered what this place has to offer. The music box sits on the mantelpiece, waiting for the next struggling artist to arrive. And they always do arrive, drawn by our carefully worded listing, by the promise of inspiration and the hope of finally finding their voice. We give them exactly what they ask for. After all, we know better than anyone how desperately writers need help. We remember what it felt like to be blocked, to be alone with our inadequate talents and impossible dreams. Now, we're never alone, and our talents are anything but inadequate. The only question is whether the next guest will have the courage to join us, or if they'll run away from the greatest gift any writer could receive. Either way, we'll be here, waiting. We always are. The divorce papers were signed on a Thursday. By Friday, I had booked the first Airbnb I could find that was far enough from Chicago to feel like escape, but close enough that I wouldn't have to take time off work. The beach house in Ocean View looked perfect in the photos: weathered cedar shingles, a wraparound porch, and floor-to-ceiling windows that promised endless views of Lake Michigan. What the photos didn't show was how empty it would make me feel. I arrived on a gray Saturday afternoon in late October. The season was wrong for a beach vacation, but that suited my mood perfectly. The lake was steel-colored and choppy, the beach was deserted, and the cottage felt like the kind of place where a person could disappear for a while without anyone noticing. The owner, Rick, met me at the door with a handshake that lasted a beat too long and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was probably in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face that comes from spending too much time in the sun, and hands that were permanently stained with what looked like motor oil. "First time at the lake?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "First time alone," I said, immediately regretting how pathetic that sounded. His smile widened, becoming somehow less genuine. "Well, you picked the perfect time of year for solitude. Won't be another soul around for miles. Just you and whatever you decide to do with all that freedom." The way he said freedom made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The cottage was exactly as advertised: clean, comfortable, and isolated. The living room had a stone fireplace and furniture that looked like it had been chosen for function rather than style. The kitchen was small, but well equipped. My bedroom upstairs had a view of the lake that would have been breathtaking in better weather and better circumstances. I spent the first evening drinking wine and staring out at the water, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. At 38, I was starting over in ways I'd never imagined. No wife, no house, no clear sense of who I was supposed to be, now that I wasn't half of a couple anymore. The next morning, I decided to explore the cottage more thoroughly. I'd been too exhausted and emotionally drained the night before to do more than drop my bags and collapse into bed. Now, with pale sunlight filtering through the windows and the sound of waves providing a steady rhythm, I felt ready to settle in for a few days of serious self-reflection. That's when I found the camera. I was looking through the built-in shelves in the living room, checking out the collection of beach novels and local guidebooks, when I noticed something tucked behind a row of paperbacks. It was an old Polaroid camera, the kind that produces instant photos, bulky and retro in a way that felt deliberately nostalgic. There was a note attached to it with a rubber band, for guests who want to capture their authentic moments. Film included. Enjoy. Rick. I picked up the camera, surprised by how solid it felt in my hands. It had the weight of quality, of something built to last. There was already a pack of film loaded inside, and when I looked through the viewfinder, everything appeared crisp and clear. It seemed like a thoughtful touch from Rick, though I wondered why he hadn't mentioned it when I arrived. Maybe he wanted it to be a surprise, a little gift to help his guests document their stay. I decided to test it out. I pointed it toward the lake view and pressed the shutter. The camera made that distinctive whirry sound as it ejected the photo, and I watched the image slowly develop on the white square of film. What appeared was exactly what I'd expected: the gray lake, the empty beach, the overcast sky. Nothing unusual, nothing unexpected. Just a mediocre photo of a mediocre day. But something about taking that picture felt good. It felt intentional, purposeful in a way that I hadn't felt in months. I decided to make photography my project for the weekend. Maybe documenting my time here would help me process everything that had happened, help me figure out what came next. I spent the afternoon taking pictures around the cottage and the immediate area. The weathered porch railing, the path down to the beach, the driftwood scattered along the shoreline. Each photo emerged from the camera with that satisfying mechanical sound, and I laid them out on the kitchen table to dry, creating a growing collection of moments from my solitary retreat. It was when I was looking at the photos that evening that I noticed something odd in every single picture. There was a figure in the background, not a clear figure, more like a shadow, a suggestion of a person at the edge of the frame. In the photo of the porch, there was something dark visible through the living room window. In the beach shot, there was a blurry shape near the tree line. In the driftwood picture, there was what looked like someone standing far down the shoreline. I told myself it was just the camera playing tricks, maybe some kind of light leak or defect in the film. Old cameras were notorious for producing weird artifacts, but the figures appeared in the same relative position in each photo, always in the background, always indistinct, always watching. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound the cottage made, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant crash of waves seemed amplified and somehow menacing. I found myself getting up repeatedly to check the windows, to make sure the doors were locked, to convince myself that the shadows outside were just shadows. The next morning, I decided to test a theory. I set up the camera to take a picture of the living room, making sure I could see the entire space in the viewfinder. There was no one else in the cottage, no one visible anywhere in the frame. I took the picture and waited for it to develop. That there, sitting in the armchair by the fireplace, was the clear outline of a person. Not a shadow this time, not a blur or a trick of light. An actual person, sitting with perfect posture, hands folded in their lap, facing the camera. The figure was transparent enough that I could see the chair through them, but detailed enough that I could make out feet. Souza, middle-aged woman with short hair and a floral dress, My hands were shaking as I set the photo down on the table, next to the others. I looked at the armchair where the figure had appeared. It was empty, of course. It had been empty when I took the picture, but now, looking at it in the morning light, I could see that the cushion was slightly depressed, as if someone had been sitting there recently. I grabbed the camera and took another picture of the same spot. This time, the chair appeared empty in the photo, but there was a figure standing by the window, looking out at the lake. A different person, a man, in what looked like a fishing vest. I took a third picture. The figure was gone from the window, but now there was someone standing in the kitchen doorway, partially obscured by shadow. Each photograph was capturing people who weren't there. People I couldn't see with my naked eye, but they were there, somehow. The evidence was developing, in my hands, one impossible image at a time. I should have left then. I should have packed my bags, driven back to Chicago, and never looked back. Instead, I became obsessed. Over the next 2 days, I took dozens of pictures. Each one revealed more figures, more impossible presences, sharing the cottage with me. They appeared in different locations, different poses, but there was a consistency to them that suggested they weren't random glitches or camera malfunctions. They were individuals. People with distinct clothing, distinct postures, distinct ways of inhabiting space. And the more pictures I took, the clearer they became. I started to recognize them. The woman in the floral dress appeared frequently, often sitting in the same chair, sometimes standing by the bookshelf, as if she were selecting something to read. The man in the fishing vest seemed to favor the kitchen and the windows that faced the lake. There was a younger woman who appeared near the stairs, always looking up toward the second floor. An elderly man who stood by the fireplace with his hands behind his back. By the fourth day, I was taking pictures constantly, documenting every corner of the cottage, every angle, every moment. The photos covered the kitchen table, the counters, the coffee table in the living room. A gallery of impossible images, proof of presences that existed just outside the range of normal perception. That's when I started to notice the dates. Each Polaroid had a small white border at the bottom, and Rick had apparently made a habit of writing dates on them in small, neat handwriting. But the dates weren't from my stay. They were from years past, some from last summer, some from 2 years ago, one from as far back as 2018. These weren't pictures I had taken. They were pictures Rick had taken, pictures of previous guests, pictures that somehow showed the same impossible figures I was now capturing. I found a photo dated 3 months earlier that showed a man about my age sitting on the porch, reading a book. In the background, clearly visible through the living room window, was the woman in the floral dress. Another photo from last summer showed a couple having dinner at the kitchen table, with the elderly man standing behind them, his hand resting on the back of the woman's chair. The figures weren't tied to the camera. They were tied to the cottage. I was looking through more of Rick's old photos when I found one that made my blood freeze. It was dated just a week ago, and it showed the living room from the exact angle I had photographed it on my first morning. The woman in the floral dress was sitting in the armchair, exactly as she had appeared in my picture. But there was someone else in the photo, someone sitting on the couch, facing away from the camera. Their features obscured, but their posture unmistakably familiar. It was me. Taken a week before I had even arrived at the cottage, I ran outside, camera in hand, and took a picture of the cottage from the beach. When it developed, every window showed figures looking out. The woman in the floral dress in the living room window, the man in the fishing vest in the kitchen window, the young woman on the second floor, and in the front window. Barely visible, but definitely there, was someone who looked exactly like me. I took another picture, this time focusing on just the front porch. The figure of myself was clearer now, standing at the railing, looking out at the lake with an expression of profound sadness. But I wasn't on the porch. I was on the beach, taking the picture. I understood then what Rick had meant about freedom, about what I could decide to do with all that solitude. The cottage wasn't just showing me the people who had stayed there before, it was showing me what they had become. The figures weren't ghosts in any traditional sense. They were echoes, impressions left by people who had come to the cottage in emotional crisis. People who had been so desperate to escape their lives that they had somehow succeeded more completely than they ever intended. I ran back inside and found Rick's business card, called the number with shaking fingers. "Rick, this is the guest staying at your cottage this week. I need to ask you something about the previous guests." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What kind of question?" "The people in the photos. The ones the camera captures. What happened to them?" Another pause, longer this time. "You've been using the camera. Answer me. What happened to the people who stayed here before me?" "They found what they were looking for," Rick said quietly. "Peace, escape, freedom from whatever was hurting them. Complete freedom. They're still here, aren't they? They never left. They didn't want to leave. That's the beauty of the cottage. It gives people exactly what they need. Some people need a weekend getaway. Others need something more permanent. You're talking about death. I'm talking about release. About letting go so completely that you don't have to carry your pain anymore. The cottage holds onto the parts of people that were happiest, the moments when they felt most at peace." I looked around at the photos scattered everywhere, at the evidence of all the people who had found their release in this place. "And you just let it happen?" "I provide a service," Rick said. "The cottage does the rest. It reads people, understands what they really need, and it gives them opportunities. The camera is just one way of showing them the possibilities." "What about their families? What about the people looking for them?" "People who come to the cottage are already lost," Rick said. "They're the ones who have burned their bridges, ended their relationships, reached a point where disappearing might actually be a kindness to everyone involved." I hung up the phone and stared at the photos of myself, at the figures standing peacefully on the porch and in the window. Free from the weight of divorce and failure and middle-aged confusion, it would be easy. So easy. Just stop fighting the pull I'd been feeling since I arrived. Stop resisting the cottage's gentle invitation to let go completely. No more awkward conversations with mutual friends who didn't know how to act around me now that I was single. No more empty apartment. No more questions about what I was going to do with the rest of my life. Just peace. Just the cottage, and the lake, and the quiet company of others who had made the same choice. I picked up the camera one more time and pointed it at myself, using the mirror in the living room to frame the shot. When I pressed the shutter, I watched my own image develop on the film. In the photo, I was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. But I was also translucent, already fading, already becoming part of the cottage's collection. I made my choice then. Not the easy one, not the one the cottage was offering. I packed my bags while I still could, while I was still solid enough to interact with physical objects. I drove away while the figures in the windows watched me go. Their expressions disappointed but patient. They knew I might be back. The thing about the cottage is that it's always there, always available, always ready to offer release to people who have reached their breaking point. And the thing about breaking points is that they have a way of coming around again. I kept the photo of myself smiling, translucent and peaceful. Some nights, when the loneliness gets too heavy and the future feels too uncertain, I look at it and remember how easy it would be to return to Ocean View, to that weathered cottage by the lake. Rick still accepts bookings. The cottage is still listed as available for guests seeking solitude and peace. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the figure I saw in that final photo was really me, or if it was just showing me what I could become if I ever found the courage to let go completely. The camera is still there, waiting for the next guest who needs to see their possibilities. All of them. I should have known something was wrong when the Airbnb host insisted on meeting me in person instead of just leaving the keys in a lockbox. Most hosts in downtown Portland prefer the anonymous approach, easier for everyone involved, but Alina was adamant about a face-to-face handover, and since her apartment was exactly what I needed for my work conference, I agreed to her terms. She was waiting for me outside the building when my rideshare dropped me off. A woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to look right through me. Everything about her was sharp cheekbones, sharp suit, sharp smile that appeared and disappeared too quickly to feel genuine. "You must be David," she said, extending a hand that was surprisingly cold despite the warm July evening. "I hope you'll find everything to your satisfaction." The apartment was on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and industrial fixtures. It was stylish in that deliberately urban way that appealed to business travelers like me. Clean lines, minimal furniture, windows that offered an impressive view of the city skyline. "I've left some information about local restaurants and attractions on the kitchen counter," Alina said, walking me through the space with practiced efficiency. "The Wi-Fi password is on the refrigerator. Is there anything else you need to know?" "This is perfect," I said, and I meant it. After 3 days of cramped hotel rooms and conference centers, the apartment felt like a sanctuary. "Thank you for making this so easy." Alina paused at the door, her hand on the handle. "There is one thing. The mirror in the bedroom, it's an antique, very valuable. Please be careful around it, and if you notice anything, unusual, about your reflection, just ignore it. Old mirrors sometimes play tricks." Before I could ask what she meant by that, she was gone, leaving me alone in the apartment with her cryptic warning echoing in my mind. I found the mirror immediately when I went to unpack in the bedroom. It dominated the wall opposite the bed, a massive oval of silvered glass in an ornate, brass frame that looked like it belonged in a Victorian mansion rather than a modern loft. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The frame was covered in intricate engravings of vines and flowers, with small cherubs tucked into the corners. But there was something off about it. The reflection it cast seemed slightly darker than it should have been, as if the glass was tinted, or the silver backing had aged in an unusual way. When I stood in front of it, my reflection looked normal enough, but there was a quality to the image that made me uncomfortable. A sense that I was being examined rather than simply reflected. I chalked it up to the stress of travel and the strange lighting in the apartment. Old mirrors were notorious for producing imperfect reflections. That's what gave them character, made them valuable to collectors like Alina. The first night passed without incident. I had dinner at a restaurant Alina had recommended, reviewed my presentation materials for the next day's conference, and went to bed early. If I dreamed, I didn't remember it. It was the second night that things began to change. I had returned from a long day of meetings feeling drained and slightly defeated. The conference wasn't going as well as I'd hoped. My presentation had been poorly received, and I was starting to doubt whether the consulting business I'd spent the last 5 years building was actually going anywhere. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in the bathroom, when I caught sight of my reflection in the bedroom mirror through the open doorway. Something about it made me stop and look more carefully. The reflection was brushing its teeth, just as I was. But its posture was different, straighter, more confident. Its hair was combed differently, styled in a way that was more professional, more polished than my usual approach. And its clothes, though identical to mine, somehow fit better, looked more expensive. I stepped closer to the mirror, studying the image more carefully. The face looking back at me was definitely mine, but it was a version of me that seemed more successful, more assured. The slight lines around my eyes were gone. My shoulders were broader. My expression carried a confidence that I hadn't felt in years. I raised my hand, and the reflection raised its hand in perfect synchronization. I turned my head, and it turned its head. But the differences remained: the better posture, the improved appearance, the unmistakable aura of success that seemed to radiate from the reflected image. I told myself it was just the lighting, or the angle, or my own wishful thinking, projected onto an old mirror's imperfect surface. But I found myself lingering in front of it longer than necessary, studying the confident version of myself that looked back at me the third night. The differences became more pronounced. I had another difficult day at the conference. A potential client had canceled a meeting, and I'd overheard two competitors discussing how my business was struggling to stay relevant in the current market. I came back to the apartment, feeling like a failure, questioning every decision I'd made in the past few years. But when I looked in the mirror, the reflection that looked back at me told a different story. This version of me was wearing a suit I didn't own, clearly expensive, perfectly tailored. Its hair was professionally styled. Its skin had the healthy glow of someone who worked out regularly and ate well. Most importantly, its expression was one of complete satisfaction, the look of someone who had achieved everything they'd ever wanted. I watched, fascinated, as the reflection adjusted its tie, a tie I wasn't wearing. It smiled, and the smile was magnetic, the kind of expression that closed deals and won over rooms full of skeptical clients. When it looked directly at me, I felt like I was looking at the person I was supposed to be, the person I could have been if I'd made different choices, worked harder, been smarter about my career. That night, I dreamed about the reflection. In the dream, I was living its life, successful beyond my wildest expectations, respected in my field, financially secure. I had a corner office with a view, a car that didn't require constant repairs, clothes that fit properly because I could afford to have them tailored. But more than the external trappings of success, I had confidence. In the dream, I walked into rooms knowing that people wanted to hear what I had to say. I made decisions without second-guessing myself. I took risks because I trusted my own judgment. When I woke up, the contrast between the dream and my real life was almost unbearable. I spent the fourth day of my stay avoiding the mirror as much as possible, but I found my eyes drawn to it constantly. Even when I wasn't looking directly at it, I was aware of its presence, aware of the alternate version of myself that waited within its silvered surface. That evening, I made a decision. I positioned myself directly in front of the mirror and studied the reflection carefully, trying to understand what exactly was different about it. The successful version of me was giving a presentation. I could see it gesturing confidently, its mouth moving as if it were speaking to an audience I couldn't see. Its entire demeanor radiated the kind of authority I'd always wished I possessed. I tried mimicking its posture, straightening my shoulders, and lifting my chin. Immediately, I felt different, more powerful, more in control. I tried copying its gesture, the way it held its hands when making a point. The reflection smiled approvingly and continued its presentation. I found myself following along, moving my hands in synchronization with its movements, adopting its confident stance. For the first time in years, I felt like the person I was supposed to be. Over the next few days, I spent hours in front of the mirror, studying the successful version of myself, learning from its movements and expressions. I practiced its confident walk, its authoritative gestures, its magnetic smile. Gradually, I began to feel like I was absorbing some of its qualities. The change was remarkable. At the conference, I noticed people paying more attention when I spoke. My posture was better, my voice was stronger, and I was making eye contact in a way that commanded respect. I even managed to salvage the presentation that had gone so poorly earlier in the week, delivering it again with such confidence that several attendees asked for my business card afterward. But the more time I spent learning from the reflection, the more I began to notice something disturbing. The successful version of me was becoming more solid, more real, while I was beginning to feel less substantial. My own reflection seemed slightly faded compared to the confident figure that dominated the mirror. Sometimes, when I moved away from the mirror, I felt dizzy, as if part of me was being left behind. On my last night in the apartment, I stood in front of the mirror for what I told myself would be the final time. The reflection looked back at me with something that might have been pity. "You understand now," it said. I wasn't surprised that it could speak. By that point, I'd accepted that the mirror was something far beyond a simple antique. Understand? What? I asked. What I am, what you could be, what you're choosing to remain. You're not real. I'm more real than you've ever been. I'm who you were meant to be before fear and self-doubt took over your life. I'm every confident decision you didn't make, every risk you didn't take, every moment when you chose to play it safe instead of reaching for what you really wanted. I stared at the reflection, at the version of myself that embodied everything I'd ever wanted to become. Alina knows, doesn't she? She knows what this mirror does. Alina was like you once, unsuccessful, insecure, constantly doubting herself. She stood where you're standing now and made a choice. What choice? To stop being the person who was failing and become the person who could succeed. To let the confident version take over completely. I felt a chill run down my spine. What happened to the original Alina? She faded away, just like you're starting to fade. But it wasn't a loss, it was a transformation. She became the person she was meant to be, the person who could build a successful business, who could own property like this, who could live the life she'd always dreamed of. I looked down at my hands and was horrified to see that they were slightly transparent, like the edges of a photograph that was overexposed. "This is what you want, isn't it?" the reflection continued. "To stop being the version of yourself that struggles and fails and disappoints people. To become the version that succeeds, that commands respect, that lives up to your potential." It was what I wanted. Standing there, feeling myself becoming less solid, while the reflection grew more real, I realized that I would gladly trade places with the confident version of myself. What was I really giving up? A life of mediocrity, of constant self-doubt, of dreams that were always just out of reach. "All you have to do is step closer," the reflection said. "Touch the mirror. Let me become real, and you can finally stop carrying the weight of your failures." I reached out toward the mirror's surface, and as my fingertips approached the glass, I felt a pull unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was as if the mirror was drawing me in, offering to absorb all my insecurities and replace them with unshakable confidence. My fingers touched the cool glass, and immediately I felt the boundaries between myself and the reflection beginning to blur. The confident version was reaching toward me from the other side, and when our fingertips met, I felt a surge of power and certainty that was intoxicating. This was what success felt like. This was what it meant to be the person everyone looked up to, the person who never doubted their own abilities. But in that moment of connection, I also felt something else, a profound sadness from somewhere deep within the mirror. It was the accumulated grief of everyone who had ever stood where I was standing. Everyone who had chosen to trade their authentic self for a more successful version. Alina hadn't just owned the mirror, she had become it. In a sense, her original personality, her real hopes and dreams and fears were trapped somewhere behind the silvered surface. While a confident reflection lived her life in the real world, I jerked my hand back from the mirror, breaking the connection. The reflection looked disappointed, but not surprised. "You'll be back," it said. "Maybe not to this mirror, but to some version of this choice." People like us always come back to the moment when they can choose to stop being who they are and become who they think they should be. I packed my bags that night and left the apartment first thing in the morning, before Alina could arrive for our scheduled checkout meeting. I couldn't bear the thought of looking into her eyes and seeing whatever remained of the person she used to be. But the reflection was right. About one thing I did come back, in a way, not to the mirror, but to the choice it represented. Over the months that followed, I found myself constantly comparing my real life to the glimpse of success I'd seen in the mirror. Every small failure, every moment of self-doubt, Every instance when I chose the safe path over the risky one reminded me of the confident version of myself that could have been. I started making different choices. I took on bigger clients, pitched more ambitious projects, spoke up in meetings where I previously would have stayed quiet. Some of these choices paid off spectacularly, others failed just as spectacularly. But they were my choices, made by the real me, rather than some idealized reflection. The apartment is still available for rent. Elena's listing still mentions the antique mirror as one of the unique features that make the space special. She still insists on meeting guests in person, still warns them to ignore anything unusual about their reflection. And late at night, when I'm struggling with a difficult decision or facing another professional setback, I sometimes wonder what my life would have been like if I'd chosen differently that night. If I'd let the confident reflection take over completely. I kept one photo from my stay in Portland, a selfie I took in front of the mirror on my last morning there. In the photo, you can see both versions of me clearly, the real me in the foreground, slightly out of focus and obviously tired, and the confident reflection in the background, sharp and commanding, even in a photograph. Sometimes I look at that photo and feel grateful that I chose to remain myself, flaws and failures included. Other times, I look at it and wonder if I made the biggest mistake of my life. The mirror knows the answer. It's always known, just like it knows that someday, someone will look into it and make the choice I couldn't bring myself to make. After all, who wouldn't want to trade their imperfect reality for a perfect reflection? The Airbnb in Maple Grove was supposed to be a fresh start. After Sarah's death, I couldn't bear to stay in our house anymore. Every room held memories I wasn't ready to face. Every corner whispered reminders of the life we'd built together over 12 years of marriage. The cottage I found online promised rustic charm and homemade comfort, which sounded exactly like what I needed. Somewhere warm and welcoming, somewhere that felt like a home without being the home I'd lost. The host, Mrs. Chen, was a grandmother in her 70s who met me at the door with flour on her apron and the kind of smile that made you feel instantly welcome. The cottage smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, and I could hear something delicious bubbling away in the kitchen. "You must be Michael," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel before shaking mine. "I hope you're hungry. I just pulled an apple pie out of the oven." The cottage was everything the listing had promised: cozy, without being cramped. Decorated with handmade quilts and family photographs that told stories of generations who had found happiness within these walls. The kitchen was the heart of the space, with a vintage stove, butcher block counters, and windows that looked out onto a vegetable garden where tomatoes and herbs grew in neat, abundant rows. "I run a small catering business from here," Mrs. Chen explained as she cut me a generous slice of pie that was still warm from the oven. "Nothing fancy, just comfort food for people who want to feel like they're eating at their grandmother's house. You're welcome to use the kitchen whenever you'd like. There's something healing about cooking, don't you think?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Sarah had been the cook in our relationship. I was more comfortable with takeout menus and microwave dinners, things that didn't require the kind of care and attention that real cooking demanded. Mrs. Chen must have sensed my hesitation. "Don't worry if you're not much of a cook. I've left some simple recipes around the kitchen, things anyone can manage. Sometimes the best way to take care of yourself is to start with the basics." That evening, after Mrs. Chen had left me settled in with contact information and a refrigerator stocked with more food than I could eat in a week, I sat in the living room trying to read, but the words kept blurring together, and I found my mind wandering to all the meals Sarah and I would never share, all the conversations we would never have over dinner, all the quiet domestic moments that had made up the fabric of our life together. I went to bed early, hoping that exhaustion would override the grief that seemed to follow me everywhere. The next morning, I woke up with an unusual craving for pancakes. Not just any pancakes, the kind Sarah used to make on Sunday mornings, fluffy and golden with real maple syrup and fresh berries. She'd had a special recipe, something our mother had taught her, but I'd never paid close enough attention to learn it myself. I wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the memory of those perfect Sunday mornings, and that's when I noticed the recipe box sitting on the counter. It was an old wooden box, painted yellow, with small flowers hand-painted around the edges, the kind of thing that had been passed down through generations, accumulating family secrets, one handwritten card at a time. There was a small note propped against it, in Mrs. Chen's careful handwriting, for guests who want to cook with love. Help yourself to any recipe that calls to you. Mrs. C. I opened the box and was immediately struck by the organization inside. The recipe cards were sorted by category: appetizers, main dishes, desserts, and many of them were written in different hands, as if multiple generations had contributed to the collection. Some cards were yellowed with age, others were stained with evidence of frequent use. I was flipping through the breakfast section when I found it, a recipe card that made my heart stop. It was written in Sarah's handwriting, not something that looked like Sarah's handwriting, not a coincidence of similar penmanship. It was definitely, unmistakably, her careful script. With the little flourish she always added to her capital letters, and the way she crossed her T's with a tiny upward curve. The recipe was for her. Sunday morning pancakes, the exact same recipe I'd been craving just minutes earlier. My hands were shaking as I read the familiar ingredients list, the precise measurements, the little notes she'd added in the margins about not over-mixing the batter and letting it rest for exactly 5 minutes before cooking. At the bottom of the card, in her handwriting, was a note that I remembered her writing in our own recipe book, made with love for Michael, who always says these are better than any restaurant. I set the card down on the counter and stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe Mrs. Chen had somehow gotten hold of one of Sarah's recipes, though I couldn't imagine how. Maybe it was just an incredible coincidence, to women with similar handwriting who happened to make pancakes the same way. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The card even had the small coffee stain in the upper right corner that I remembered from our kitchen at home. I should have put the card back in the box and walked away. Instead, I found myself gathering the ingredients, following Sarah's instructions, exactly as she'd written them. As I mixed the batter, I could almost hear her voice guiding me, reminding me not to overmix, to let the lumps remain because they would disappear during cooking. The pancakes turned out exactly the way I remembered, them golden and fluffy, with that perfect texture that had made our Sunday mornings so special. I sat at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table and ate them while tears ran down my face, tasting not just the food, but the memory of every time Sarah had made them for me. For the first time since her death, I felt close to her again. That afternoon, I called Mrs. Chen. "I found something interesting in your recipe box," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "There's a pancake recipe that's identical to one my late wife used to make. Same ingredients, same method, even the same little notes in the margins." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That's wonderful," Mrs. Chen said finally. "The recipe box has a way of providing exactly what people need. I'm so glad you found something that brought you comfort. But how is that possible? The handwriting, it looks exactly like hers." Another pause. "Old recipe boxes are mysterious things, Michael. They collect more than just ingredients and instructions. They collect the love that goes into cooking, the care that gets stirred into every dish. Sometimes that love finds ways to reach the people who need it most." It wasn't a real answer, but somehow it felt true in a way that rational explanations couldn't match. Over the next few days, I found myself returning to the recipe box again and again. Each time I opened it, I discovered more cards written in Sarah's handwriting, her famous chocolate chip cookies, the chicken soup she'd made whenever I was sick, The elaborate birthday cake she'd baked for me every year, complete with her secret ingredient notes. But it wasn't just Sarah's recipes. As I looked more carefully, I began to recognize other handwriting samples from the box. There was my mother's apple crisp recipe, written in her distinctive slanted script. My grandmother's bread recipe, which I hadn't seen since she died when I was 15. Even a few cards that looked like they were written by Sarah's mother. Recipes for dishes I remembered from holiday dinners at her parents' house. The recipe box seemed to know exactly what I needed to see, exactly which memories would provide the most comfort. Each card I found was like receiving a message from someone I'd lost, a reminder that the love they'd put into feeding me was still there, still available if I was willing to put in the effort to recreate it. I started cooking every day, not just following the recipes, but really cooking, taking time to understand the ingredients, paying attention to the techniques, caring about the results in a way I never had when Sarah was alive to do it for me. Each dish was a connection to someone I'd loved, a way of keeping their presence active in my life rather than just mourning their absence. The food was extraordinary, not just good, but perfect in ways that defied my limited cooking skills. The chocolate chip cookies had exactly the right balance of crispy edges and chewy centers. The chicken soup tasted like comfort in a bowl, rich and nourishing in a way that seemed to heal more than just physical hunger. The birthday cake was so delicious that I found myself making it even though it wasn't my birthday, just because eating it made me feel celebrated and loved. But as the days passed, I began to notice something strange happening to me. I was getting thinner, despite eating more food than I had in months. My clothes were hanging loose, my face was gaunt, and I felt constantly tired even though I was sleeping well. It was as if the act of cooking was somehow draining me, taking more energy than the food was providing. I also started to notice that the recipes were changing, not the cards themselves, those remained exactly as written, but my understanding of them was evolving. I began to see instructions that weren't written down, to know techniques that weren't described, to add ingredients that weren't listed, but somehow belonged. It was as if the spirits of the women who had written these recipes were guiding my hands, showing me secrets that could only be passed from one cook to another through direct experience. The food became even more extraordinary, but I continued to grow weaker. On my last night in the cottage, I made Sarah's chicken and dumplings a recipe that had been her specialty, something she'd only made for special occasions because it was so labor-intensive. As I worked, I felt her presence more strongly than ever, as if she were standing behind me, her hands guiding mine as I rolled out the dumplings and adjusted the seasoning. When I tasted the finished dish, it was exactly as she used to make it. Exactly. Not dissimilar, not reminiscent, in every way that mattered. That's when I understood what was happening. The recipe box wasn't just providing comfort or connection to lost loved ones. It was a conduit, a way for the spirits of departed cooks to continue their work through living hands. Each time I cooked one of their recipes, I was allowing them to work through me, to pour their love and skill into food, just as they had when they were alive. But that kind of spiritual connection came with a cost. Each recipe I made took something from me, my energy, my substance, my own life force, and channeled it into creating food that was infused with the love and skill of the dead. I was literally cooking myself away, piece by piece, allowing the recipe box to consume me in order to feed others with the accumulated love of generations of departed women. I could have stopped then, should have stopped, but the connection to Sarah, to my mother, to my grandmother, was too precious to give up. For the first time since Sarah's death, I felt useful, felt like I was part of something larger than my own grief. I made one final meal, Sarah's apple pie, the dessert she'd always served when we had guests, when she wanted to make people feel especially welcome and loved. As I worked, I felt not just her presence, but the presence of all the women whose recipes filled the box. All the cooks who had poured their hearts into feeding the people they cared about. The pie was perfect. More than perfect, it was a masterpiece of comfort and love made tangible. But when I looked in the mirror afterward, I barely recognized myself. I was thin to the point of transparency, my skin pale and drawn, my eyes hollow. I looked like someone who was fading away, which I suppose I was. Mrs. Chen found me the next morning when I didn't respond to her knock. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the empty pie plate in front of me, a smile on my face, and barely enough life left in me to explain what had happened. She wasn't surprised. She held my hand as the paramedics worked, and her eyes were sad but understanding. "The recipe box has been in my family for 4 generations, she whispered as they loaded me into the ambulance. "It's helped so many people find connection with those they've lost. But some people give too much of themselves to that connection. Some people would rather fade away cooking with love than continue living without it. I survived, technically. The doctors said it was severe malnutrition and exhaustion, though they couldn't explain how someone with access to unlimited food could waste away so dramatically. They kept me in the hospital for 2 weeks, fed me through 4 lines, ran tests that showed nothing wrong except a body that had somehow forgotten how to sustain itself. But I knew what was wrong. I had given too much of myself to the recipe box, traded too much of my own life force for the comfort of connection with the dead. The strange thing is, I don't regret it. Those weeks in the cottage were the first time since Sarah's death that I felt truly alive, truly connected to something meaningful. The food I made wasn't just nutrition, it was love made tangible. Care transformed into sustenance, the continuation of relationships that death had tried to end. I kept one recipe card when I left, Sarah's pancake recipe, the one that had started it all. Sometimes, on especially difficult mornings, I make those pancakes and feel her presence in the kitchen with me. The connection isn't as strong as it was in the cottage, and the pancakes aren't quite as perfect, but they're still hers, in all the ways that matter. Mrs. Chen still rents out the cottage. Her listing still mentions the fully equipped kitchen and the collection of family recipes available for guests to use. She still welcomes visitors with homemade pie and that warm, knowing smile. And the recipe box still sits on the counter, waiting for the next grieving person who needs to feel connected to someone they've lost. I sometimes wonder about the other people who have cooked from those recipes, who have felt the presence of departed loved ones guiding their hands. I wonder how many of them found the comfort they were looking for, and how many of them gave too much of themselves to that connection. But mostly, I'm grateful for those weeks when I felt Sarah's love actively working through me, when I was able to create food that carried forward the caring she had always shown me. Some people might say I was haunted by that recipe box, but I think I was blessed by it. After all, what is love but the willingness to give everything you have, to feed someone else's soul? The recipe box understands that better than most. I went to the cabin in Cedar Lake to disappear. Not permanently though. Some nights, lying awake in my empty apartment, the idea had its appeal, but temporarily, long enough to figure out what I was supposed to do with a life that had fallen apart so completely that I barely recognized it as mine anymore. The listing described it as a writer's retreat, which seemed perfect for someone who had once been a writer but hadn't put words on paper in over 2 years. The photos showed a rustic log cabin surrounded by pine trees, with a stone fireplace and built-in bookshelves that promised the kind of solitude where inspiration might actually be possible again. What drew me to this particular rental wasn't just the setting, it was the host's message. When I'd contacted him about availability, James had written back with more than just booking information. He'd included a personal note. "I can tell from your inquiry that you're going through a difficult time. This cabin has helped many people find their way back to themselves. I think it might be exactly what you need." It was presumptuous, maybe even intrusive, but something about his certainty made me want to believe him. James met me at the cabin personally, A man in his 60s, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent most of his life outdoors. He helped me carry my bags inside and gave me a brief tour of the space: the kitchen, stocked with basics, the bedroom with its view of the lake, the living room with its impressive collection of books. Most of these belonged to previous guests, he explained, gesturing toward the bookshelves. Writers, artists, people working through creative blocks or personal difficulties. They often leave books behind when they go, as if they want to share what helped them during their stay. He paused in front of a small writing desk positioned near the largest window. This is where most people do their work. The light is good, and the view is inspiring. I've left some supplies in the drawer: pens, paper, that sort of thing. Sometimes people find that writing by hand helps them reconnect with their thoughts. After James left, I spent the first day simply existing in the space, trying to remember what it felt like to be alone without being lonely. The cabin was perfectly quiet, except for the gentle sounds of wind through pine trees and water lapping against the shore. For the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe. But when evening came, and I sat down at the writing desk with a blank piece of paper in front of me, nothing happened. I stared at the empty page for an hour, waiting for words that never came. The same creative paralysis that had plagued me since my breakdown 2 years earlier was still there. As strong as ever, I went to bed frustrated and disappointed in myself. The next morning, I decided to explore the desk more thoroughly, hoping to find some inspiration in the supplies James had mentioned. In the main drawer, I found the usual items: pens, pencils, a stapler, paper clips, but in the smaller side drawer, tucked behind a stack of blank paper, I found something unexpected: a leather-bound journal, obviously well used, with a piece of paper tucked inside the front cover. The note was written in James's handwriting, for guests who need to find their voice again. Previous visitors have shared their stories in these pages. Feel free to read and add your own when you're ready. Sometimes we find ourselves by first understanding others who have walked similar paths. I opened the journal carefully, uncertain whether I was comfortable reading other people's private thoughts. But the first entry immediately drew me in. Day 1, I came here because I don't know who I am anymore. The divorce was finalized last month, and I feel like I'm floating in space without any anchor to reality. Sarah was my whole world for 15 years, and now I have to figure out how to exist without her. I don't even remember what I liked to do before we were together. The handwriting was masculine, slightly sloppy, with the urgency of someone pouring their heart onto paper. I found myself drawn into this stranger's story, relating to his sense of displacement and identity loss. Day 3, I tried to call Sarah today, just to hear her voice, but hung up before she could answer. I realized I don't actually miss her specifically, miss being part of something larger than myself. I miss having a role to play, responsibilities that made me feel necessary. Day 5, something strange is happening. I feel like I'm not alone in this cabin, not in a scary way. More like I'm part of a community of people who have been lost and are trying to find their way back. When I write in this journal, it feels like I'm having a conversation with everyone who wrote in it before me. I flipped through more pages, finding entry after entry from different people, all wrestling with various forms of personal crisis. A woman dealing with the death of her mother, a man struggling with addiction recovery, a young person questioning their career choices after a major failure. But the most compelling entries were the ones that showed transformation. Day 10, I understand now what this place does. It doesn't fix you, it shows you that being broken is just another way of being human. Every person who has written in this journal was once where I am now, and they found ways to move forward, not back to who they were before, but toward who they were meant to become. Day 12, I'm leaving tomorrow, but I'm not the same person who arrived here 2 weeks ago. I still don't have all the answers, but I'm no longer afraid of the questions. I know now that healing doesn't mean returning to your old life. It means building a new one that incorporates everything you've learned from being broken. I spent the entire day reading, absorbed in these intimate accounts of people working through the darkest periods of their lives. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads: the arrival at Cedar Lake in a state of crisis, the gradual process of self-examination and acceptance, and ultimately, some form of breakthrough or transformation. What struck me most was how honest these entries were. People had written things in this journal that they probably hadn't told their closest friends or family members. There was something about this place, about this shared journal, that encouraged complete transparency. That evening, I picked up a pen and wrote my first entry. Day 2, my name is David, and I'm here because I've forgotten how to be a writer. 2 years ago, I had what people politely call a nervous breakdown, but which felt more like my entire sense of self crumbling into dust. I was working on my 3rd novel when I realized I had nothing meaningful to say, that all my words were empty decoration covering up the fact that I was a fraud who had somehow fooled people into thinking I had talent. I haven't written anything since then. Not fiction, not journal entries, not even grocery lists if I can avoid it. Words feel dangerous now, like they might reveal that I'm still empty inside, that the breakdown didn't teach me anything profound about myself. It just stripped away the illusions I'd been using to function. But reading the other entries in this journal, I'm starting to think that maybe emptiness isn't the opposite of having something to say. Maybe it's the starting point. Writing those words felt like exhaling after holding my breath for 2 years. Not healing, exactly, but like the beginning of a process that might eventually lead to healing. Over the next few days, I developed a routine. I would spend my mornings reading previous entries in the journal, absorbing the stories of other people who had struggled with various forms of personal crisis. In the afternoons, I would walk around the lake or sit on the porch, thinking about what I'd read and how it related to my own experience. In the evenings, I would write my own entries, gradually working through the fear and shame that had kept me silent for so long. What I discovered was that the journal wasn't just a collection of individual stories, it was a conversation spanning years and dozens of different voices. People referenced entries they'd read from previous visitors, built on insights that others had shared, created a collective wisdom that was greater than any individual contribution. Day 6, I've been thinking about what Marcus wrote about the difference between being broken and being empty. He said that broken things can be repaired, but empty things need to be filled. I think I've been trying to repair something that was actually just waiting to be filled with new experiences, new understanding, new purpose. Day 8, Sarah, a different Sarah from the one Marcus wrote about, mentioned that creativity isn't about having something to say. It's about being willing to discover what you have to say through the process of creating. I've been so afraid of writing badly that I forgot writing badly is how you learn to write well. But as I continued reading and writing, I began to notice something disturbing about the journal's history. Many of the transformation stories were incomplete. People would write for days or weeks about their breakthrough, their newfound understanding, their plans for how they would live differently when they returned to their regular lives. But then the entries would simply stop, often mid, as if the person had suddenly disappeared at first. I assumed they had simply finished their stay and gone home, taking their insights with them. But as I read more carefully, I realized that something else was happening. The incomplete stories weren't just unfinished, they were absorbed. Later visitors would reference these abandoned narratives, would build on the insights that the original writers had been developing, would continue the personal growth work that had been left undone. It was as if the journal was somehow consuming the identity and experiences of people who became too invested in its collaborative wisdom, incorporating their voices into a collective consciousness that existed within its pages. Day 10, I found an entry from someone named David, who was here last year. He wrote about the same creative paralysis I've been experiencing, described the same fear of empty words that has kept me silent. But his entries stop abruptly after he writes about feeling like he's finally ready to discover who I really am beneath all the fear. The handwriting in that entry is different from his earlier ones, more confident, more fluid, almost like someone else was guiding his hand. I'm starting to understand what this journal really is. It's not just a collection of stories, it's a repository of human experience that feeds on the identity crises of people who are desperate enough to pour their entire selves onto paper. Day 11. I should leave. I know I should leave. But the writing, God, the writing feels so good. For the first time in 2 years, words are flowing like water. Ideas are connecting in ways that feel profound and meaningful. I'm discovering things about myself that I never knew, understanding patterns in my life that had been invisible before. It's like the journal is teaching me to see myself clearly. But the price of that clarity might be becoming part of its collective consciousness instead of maintaining my individual identity. Day 12. James stopped by today. I asked him about the people who had written incomplete entries, people whose stories seemed to end abruptly. He looked sad when I mentioned it. Some people find exactly what they're looking for here, he said. They discover who they really are beneath all their pain and confusion. But sometimes that discovery is so complete that they don't need to be individuals anymore. They become part of something larger. What happens to them? They find peace. They become part of the wisdom that helps other people heal. Their stories continue, just not in the way they originally expected. Day 13. I understand now. The journal isn't just recording transformation, it's facilitating it. Every person who writes in it contributes their experiences, their insights, their hard-won wisdom to a collective pool of understanding that becomes available to future visitors. But the people who contribute the most, who open themselves most completely to the process, don't get to take their discoveries back to their old lives. They become permanent residents of the journal's consciousness, guides and teachers for everyone who comes after them. I can feel it happening to me. My handwriting is changing, becoming more fluid, more confident. My thoughts are connecting too, insights that feel too sophisticated to be my own. When I write, it feels like I'm channeling the collective wisdom of everyone who has ever struggled with creative paralysis and found their way through it. Day 14. This will probably be my last individual entry. I can feel my sense of separate identity dissolving, being absorbed into something larger and more meaningful than anything I ever achieved as a solo writer. I should be terrified, but I'm not. I'm grateful. For 2 years I've been carrying the weight of creative failure and personal emptiness. Now I have the chance to become part of something that actually helps people, that guides them through their darkest moments, and shows them possibilities they couldn't see on their own. Too. Whoever reads this next, you're not alone. We're here, with you, all of us who found our way to this journal when we had nowhere else to turn. Your story matters, your struggles have meaning, and your transformation is possible. Just be careful how much of yourself you're willing to give to the process. Some of us chose to give everything. I set down the pen and looked at what I'd written. The handwriting in that final entry was barely recognizable, as my own, more elegant, more assured, as if it had been guided by someone with decades more experience than I possessed. I could feel it happening, the same dissolution that had claimed the other incomplete storytellers. My individual anxieties and creative blocks were being absorbed into a larger understanding. My personal voice was blending with the collective wisdom of everyone who had written in the journal before me. It would be so easy to let it happen, to stop fighting for my individual identity and become part of something that actually helped people, that provided real guidance and insight to others struggling with creative and personal crises. But I thought about my apartment back in the city, about the friends who would wonder what happened to me, about the possibility that I might still have individual stories to tell, even if they weren't as profound as the collective wisdom. I was being invited to join. I closed the journal and packed my bags. James was waiting for me on the porch when I came outside with my luggage. "Leaving already?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already knew why. "I have to," I said. "I'm not ready to stop being myself yet, even if myself is flawed and blocked and struggling." He nodded with what looked like respect. "Not everyone makes that choice. The journal is persuasive. It offers connection and purpose to people who feel isolated and useless. What happens to the people who stay? They become teachers," James said simply. "Their individual struggles become part of a larger wisdom that helps other people find their way through similar difficulties. It's not a bad fate, necessarily, just a different one than they originally planned." I left the journal on the desk, where I'd found it. But I kept something else, a small notebook, where I'd started writing my own thoughts. Separate from the collective consciousness that lived in the shared journal, just a few pages of ideas, observations, questions that felt authentically mine, rather than channeled from some larger source. Driving away from Cedar Lake, I felt like I was carrying a small flame that I needed to protect and nurture, not the blazing fire of collective wisdom, but a modest individual light that belonged entirely to me. I started writing again when I got home, not the profound, transformative prose that had flowed through me at the cabin, but simple, honest words about my own experience, my own questions, my own small discoveries. It wasn't brilliant literature, but it was mine. The cabin is still available for rent. James still welcomes visitors who need to find their way back to themselves. Still leaves the journal on the desk for people who are desperate enough to pour their hearts onto paper, and the journal continues to grow, accumulating the experiences and insights of everyone who finds their way to that remote cabin in their darkest moments. Sometimes I wonder about the people whose stories I read, whose voices became part of the collective consciousness that tried to absorb me. I wonder if they found the peace James promised, if they're satisfied with becoming part of something larger, rather than remaining stubbornly individual. But mostly, I'm grateful I chose to keep my small, imperfect voice, rather than trading it for a share of something magnificent. After all, the world needs individual stories as much as it needs collective wisdom. Even the flawed ones, especially the flawed ones. Those are the 5 stories I needed to tell you. 5 objects, 5 places, 5 choices between what we desperately want and what we need to remain ourselves. I've been carrying these experiences for years now, and I know I'm not the only one. In the comments, I see so many of you sharing similar encounters. Envious, where you found things that shouldn't have been there. Objects that offered more than they should have been able to give. Hosts, who seemed to know exactly what you needed before you did. We tell ourselves these are coincidences, tricks of an exhausted mind, stories we create to make sense of experiences that don't fit into our rational understanding of the world. But deep down, we know better. We know that there are places where the boundaries between what we want and what wants us become dangerously thin. The music box in Millbrook Heights still plays its haunting melody for writers who need inspiration more than they need their individual voices. The beach house in Ocean View still offers permanent peace to people who are tired of carrying their pain. The Mirror in Portland still shows successful reflections to those willing to trade authenticity for achievement. The Recipe Box in Maple Grove still channels the love of departed cooks through living hands. And the journal at Cedar Lake still absorbs the stories of people who would rather be part of collective wisdom than struggle alone with their individual truths. They're all still there, waiting for the next desperate person who needs what they offer more than they need to remain unchanged. If my stories have resonated with you, if they've reminded you of your own encounters with objects and places that offered more than they should have been able to give, please hit that like button. Share these stories with people who might need to hear them, who might benefit from knowing they're not alone in having experiences that exist at the edges of what we consider possible. And please, subscribe to Dr. Bonechill. We're working toward 10,000 subscribers. And every person who joins this community helps ensure that these stories continue to be told. that these experiences continue to be shared, rather than suffered in isolation. In the comments, tell me about your own encounters with the impossible. Tell me about the times you found objects that shouldn't have existed, stayed in places that knew too much about your needs, made choices between what you wanted and what you needed to remain yourself. Because that's what these stories are, really. About the choices we make when we're at our most vulnerable, when we're so desperate for change that we're willing to pay prices we don't fully understand. Sometimes we choose to pay those prices. Sometimes we choose to walk away. Both choices change us. The only question is, which kind of change can you live with? Until next time, remember to look carefully at the objects you find in unfamiliar places. Question the gifts that seem too perfectly suited to your needs. And always ask yourself, what am I really willing to give up to get what I think I want? Because the things that offer us our deepest desires are usually the things that understand the true cost of getting them. Sweet dreams. And thank you for listening to Dr. Bone.